But it is a major power, and we have to deal with it. And we have to deal with it in a way that we didn't have to with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union set up a rival economic system where China, for better or worse, is plugged into the global economy.
I think it's unlikely we're going to be told precisely who was organizing the hacking that we're going to hear about. It may be an organ of the state. We have to assume that that's probable. But it may not necessarily be. I think the point you make is absolutely right, that since this information is very widely available on its own, it doesn't really mean a great deal. But I raised specifically last week in Beijing with a whole series of different officials, including the number 4 ranking official in the Communist Party, Wang Huning, the fact that if China wanted to be perceived as more likable by the West, if it wanted to differentiate itself more from Russia, which is widely seen by us and elsewhere in Europe as an enemy of what we all stand for, then making sure, and actually I encourage them to put out statements, that they would not be interfering in any way with the general election this year could be an important part of trying to rebuild some confidence. So it will be interesting to see what their reaction to this is, because I'm quite sure the Foreign Office will be calling in Ambassador Zheng to remonstrate with him. And I very much hope that they will, commit now not to hacking and interfering with electoral processes or MPs' telephones, but we'll have to wait and see.
When you were in Beijing, did you get the sense that the Chinese state, the Communist Party, wanted to be perceived as more likable by the West? Is that a concern of theirs? Or actually flexing their muscles, having the West, whether it's Britain or America, on the back foot, talking about them, reacting to them, being frightened of them is part of what they want? Do you think they never mind whether or not they do put out statements saying they don't want to interfere with our elections, do you think they want to be perceived as being more likable by the West?
I do, yes, because there are tangible effects on the Chinese economy from a gradual reduction in foreign investment in China, a reduction in the number of foreign tourists, of foreign business people living there, partly as a result of the very difficult conditions in the pandemic in China. And I do think that they want to be a key part of the international sort of rules and systems, and not being liked and being seen as hostile by Western countries is not part of the grand plan. So I do think that they're trying to improve this, but there is a difference, of course, between trying to improve perceptions by sort of being nice to everyone and actually taking actions that are going to make us look on China in a different way. So I spent quite a lot of time last week also very much encouraging China to play a positive role in trying to resolve the incredibly difficult Ukraine situation, because they have leverage on Russia that the rest of us don't necessarily have. And they also have a big stake in Ukraine. So they are interested in that. I think they've already said publicly they're going to try and join the conference that's being planned in Switzerland. And that could be one tangible way of really demonstrating that they are on the side of peace and not supporting those who are invading countries in the West.
China targeted our electoral system back in 2021. More recently, a group of British politicians are also thought to have been targeted in cyber attacks as well. Let's just state the case for how worried we should be. How big is the threat? How big is the challenge, if you prefer to use that word, as Rishi Sunak did earlier?
Yes, this is huge. We need to recognize that China domestically sees this as normal behavior. It monitors its own population. It harnesses that digital surveillance to better understand what individuals are up to. It uses large computer algorithms to identify any questionable behavior. So perhaps it's not surprised that given what it does domestically, it's now extending that internationally to better understand what other countries, what individuals are saying as well. Some of us have been critical, quite rightly, about where China wants to take the world. It has a different interpretation of our world order. It wants to exploit perhaps our timidity to stand up to China, given how huge China economically is nowadays. But nevertheless, there are big question marks about how China is exploiting our own freedoms of expression, our own openness, our own transparency to harvest their own data to understand what we're up to. And I'm really pleased that the Deputy Prime Minister is taking a stand. We need to work together with our international colleagues on this, our allies as well. Only then we'll be able to actually provide us a mechanism, if you like, that allows us to work with China in the long term, but allow a direction of travel that says what is acceptable given the impact the digital domain is now having on every part of our lives.
Yeah, and as big a story, Tobias, is how we are currently, or we seem to be currently, pretty powerless to do anything about it. What will China be doing with those details of 40 million British voters? What is typical of them to do with that data?
So I think that particular question, I think there's less of interest because it's literally the electoral roll. More, the bigger question is what else have they done? What else are they up to? What other things are they trying to find out about us? And that is the bigger question mark as to what they're doing as they trawl through the data. They try and get access. Now, whether that's through cyber attacks to actually cause problems, to distract us from perhaps challenging China on some of its own domestic behaviors, how it's treating the Uyghur population, for example. Britain has been very critical about that. Its new security laws that it's introduced in Hong Kong against the trends, against the promises that it made when it gains control of Hong Kong. And then the wider issues is to do with its relationship with Russia that we see growing ever stronger. So it's how it might utilize the data in the longer term as well. What, as I say, is becoming normalized if we don't stand up and make our mark here.
Yeah, and many people listening might have a couple of thoughts. First of all, that China interference, China cyber hacking is nothing new. So what's changed in order for Oliver Dowden to get up and want to say something about it? And actually, what can we do, Tobias? That is probably the more pertinent question. What is in our power to do about this?
Yeah, I mean, you are right to say that it seems nothing new from that perspective, but it is fairly new, and they're getting more and more robust, more and more assertive, and we need to absolutely become more resolute in standing up to this errant behavior. Otherwise, it is normalized as such, and it isn't the way the West and our global order is wanting to operate, as I say, because the way the digital plane is actually becoming just as important as the physical terrain in order for us to protect ourselves and protect our economy as well. We're becoming increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks. It's far easier to actually mount a cyber attack on the City of London, for example, and the huge damage that will cause to our economy, rather than actually doing something physical with a dirty bomb or indeed blowing up, let's say, one of our cables, undersea cables, for example.
But people will still ask, Tobias Elwood, what can we actually do? We know that we sanction China on a regular basis. Sometimes those sanctions get lifted, sometimes they get imposed. But actually, what are the material things that we, the UK, can do to try and stop this interference from China? No one wants their voter records accessed, do they? But it feels to many people like the UK is pretty powerless.
Well, firstly, we build up our own resilience, and the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, is doing that, working with our agencies, so we have a tougher capability to protect ourselves from these attacks. Secondly, as we'll hear today, we're calling individuals out that are called out in this way. Secondly, we're raising this on an international level, because you're right to say that unless we team up, unless we work with our allies and question this behavior, then it will be normalized as such. So we need to have a robust approach, which actually suggests we start to stand up to China. And perhaps that's the bigger question as to where our world is going. It's certainly getting more dangerous, not less. And this is an advance, if you like, of the character of conflict. It's not direct war, but we're not at peace. And we're not at peace because these attacks are continuing again and again and again.
Yeah,
so we need to work out a way of punishing and holding China to account.
Is China a threat? The Chinese Communist Party is a threat. And it's really defined itself as that ever since about the time that Xi Jinping came into power and urged the party cadres and the government cadres, as they call them, to engage in what was described as an intense struggle. And then they described all the features which you and I would recognize as being aspects of an open society, of a liberal democracy. not just elections and freedom of speech and rule of law, but all those things associated with, like civil society. And they'd said at that time that those things were an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party's control.
Yes.
They said that there had to be a fight against them, which in my book suggested that they were a threat to us. And they've behaved like that ever since. But I think what will annoy Beijing is the fact that this has been made public and that we're working with other like-minded countries to actually call it out and to point out what is happening. And the Chinese hate any of that happening. So I think the first step is that we've pointed out what everybody's known for ages and done so pretty publicly. What we then do about it in terms of sanctions and so on is another matter. And as one of the questioners made the point, talking to Oliver Dowden, I think in relation to Hong Kong, the US government have sanctioned 20 people. I don't think anybody has been sanctioned by the UK. There's a very good book by Steve Chang, who hasn't perhaps, and I'm putting the point very mildly, always been as well treated by employers in this country as he should have been. But he's now, he was very good at Oxford, and he's now brilliant at SOAS, where he's a professor. But I think he endured en route some of the bobbing and ducking and weaving of academic authorities, nervous about upsetting the Chinese. He's pointed out in a new book called The Political Thinking of Xi Jinping exactly what Xi's views are. He thinks that there should be one boss of the Communist Party, which is himself. So he's done away with the collective leadership which Deng Xiaoping had tried to introduce. And thirdly, he doesn't have any idea about a new world order. He hates the one that exists at the moment, but he thinks that what should happen is the rest of the world should give the mandate of heaven to China, and simply follow China and let it do whatever it wants. Now, that is not in our interest. It's probably not in the Chinese people's interest, but it's certainly what he has been absolutely explicit in arguing for. So I think we have to recognize that he's, might have been innocent having a drink of beer with him at a pub near Chequers a few years ago, but he's certainly not somebody you'd want to have a glass of beer with now. First of all, we have to make sure that our security arrangements are as properly funded as possible. And that's security arrangements differ whether you're talking about armaments in relation to Russia in particular, but armaments, but also cybersecurity measures in relation to the Chinese. We should not be deluded into thinking that economic progress and change in China, which is actually stalling at the moment, will suddenly produce a parliamentary democracy. When China joined the World Trade Organization, Tony Blair said, which wasn't the smartest thing he's ever said, that China's road to parliamentary democracy was now unstoppable. Well, what we have to do, I think, is first of all to recognize that you don't have to follow China's political narrative in order to do business with China. And anyway, China with us, for example, has a substantial margin of trade in its own favor. Secondly, I think you also have to be absolutely explicit when China breaks its word with international agreements, as it did with us over the joint declaration with Hong Kong, as it did over the international health regulations, because it's, of course, still obfuscating how the coronavirus started. And there are serious arguments about the extent to which a leak came from a Chinese laboratory. So you have to do those things. And I think you also have to make sure that you don't become too dependent on either precious metals or technology or other goods which are important from China. And you have to be particularly cautious about anything which can be used for cyber, for surveillance, or for attacks on our important infrastructure. So you've got to do all those things. And I think the more open you are in doing that, the more secure you are against threats from China. We wouldn't regard it as an inhibition in dealing with anybody else. Of course, China's important. 1.4 billion people, or more or less, The fact that the economy in China is stumbling is not in our interest any more than it's in China's, and that should really concern us. But you shouldn't have to think that in order to, for example, sell any goods to China, you have to accept their position on Taiwan. And Taiwan is an example of how wrong they are about the international order, because Taiwan is a democratic state. It has the rule of law. It has free speech. It's Chinese as well. It's a Confucian society in a sense. So there's no contradiction between being a Confucian Chinese society and believing in democracy.
For a perspective from China, let's hear from Victor Gao, Vice President of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization. Good morning to you, Victor.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Why has China attacked UK democracy? Why has China undertaken this attempt to hack into the electoral register and go after private details of British citizens?
First of all, I would say such allegation is completely ungrounded. China has no interest at all to attack the democratic system in the United Kingdom. And the UK system is completely different from China. From the Chinese perspective, UK is not a threat, not an enemy, not an adversary, not a competitor. UK is just a very important country to be engaged with for mutual benefit. Therefore, such allegation, I hope, will be proven to be groundless and misguided, and the British side need to come up with firm evidence to back up its claim, if any, in order to really substantiate such.
It's not just Britain, actually. It's not just Britain, actually, is it? It's America as well. Britain and the United States together today have accused China of launching a prolific global campaign of cyber attacks. New Zealand has accused China of doing the same thing. Either you think these three states are lying, and I'm interested to think why would they lie about this, or there are grounds to suggest that China is engaged in a very widespread, prolific attempt to hack into the databases of other countries.
If you really believe in the allegations of hostility against China by the United States, then as a member of the Congress of the United States suggested, they even see a threat in Chinese exporting garlic to the United States. And they want to label that as a threat to the US national security. They've persisted in claims against Huawei, and Huawei has demonstrated again and again it's an outstanding, excellent tech company. It's not engaged in national security. And therefore, you really need to take the allegations from Washington with a kind of a piece of salt in your mouth rather than taking it at its face value.
But it's not. But what about the UK? So Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister, has said there is a problem with China. There's a strong case that China should be considered a threat to our nation. Not because they're concerned about imports and exports, because they think China is aggressively attacking, cyber attacking British institutions, including the electoral register. They didn't present that as a claim and a wonder. They said, no. We've established, our security services have established that China is attacking British institutions.
First of all, if you accuse China of attacking the United Kingdom, then you need to ask, as a very pragmatic people, for the British people, what does China threaten the United Kingdom with? Does China threaten the constitutional monarchy in the United Kingdom, or the parliamentary democracy, or the votings, for example, at all levels, or the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Great Britain? No. If anyone can come up with any real backed up allegation about such threat from China, I'll be very happy to debate with him or her face to face. Nothing can be proven. And China believes Britain is so far away on the other side of the Eurasian continent, in the island, and we are so far away from each other, we need to get along with each other rather than threatening each other.
But they feel the threats
treat each other as an enemy of each other.
What would happen if Britain does designate China as a threat?
Nothing will be a free lunch. If you want to designate a major country as a threat, you will be dealt with as a threat yourself. This is reciprocity, and reciprocity is the fundamental principle in diplomacy of all kinds at all levels. I want to see Britain as a normal country, constructive country as far as China is concerned, and I do not want to see China being labeled as a threat to the United Kingdom.
Talk us through
if anyone has any allegation, come up with the evidence.
Talk us through what reciprocity might look like, because it's distinctly possible that China is going to be called a threat. Certainly, there's many people in the cabinet who want to do so. Say that happens, what sort of reciprocal action will China take? Will it be in trade terms? What other means does China have to reciprocate that type of move by the British government?
It is up to the Chinese government to make that decision. However, I can say if you label China as a threat, you will be labeled on the reciprocal basis as a threat. If you want to impose sanctions against China, China will impose sanctions against Britain. China will not take initiative to do stupid things like that. But if such unguided, misguided things will be done in London, don't believe you will be completely immune to repercussions. And if anyone knows diplomacy ABC, he or she should know that reciprocity will be occurring if a decision is made in London against a major country in the world.
Can now speak to Lord Ricketts. Peter Ricketts, the UK government's first national security advisor. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
I think you managed to hear most of what Victor Gao had to say. I'm sure you've heard this kind of stuff before. But do you think is he speaking is he mirroring what you think the Chinese government might be thinking? That if you're not, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you designate us as a threat, we'll do the same to you. If you impose sanctions, we'll impose sanctions too. Do you think that's likely?
I think he's a very close spokesman of what the Chinese government think. Yes, he's a smooth and articulate spokesman for them. And of course, it's easy to say, produce the evidence behind malicious cyber activity. Evidence is always difficult to produce, but the National Cybersecurity Center took 2 years to attribute this hack on the Electoral Commission to China. I've got complete confidence that they have made a good judgment there. And clearly he didn't know what actually the Chinese government would do, but threatening reciprocity in general terms, attempts to sort of intimidate and deter us from taking the action, whatever the action that UK government judges is necessary.
This has always been a very delicate equation, a kind of balancing act. On the one side, you have national security concerns, and on the other side, you have this trade relationship, £93 billion, I think it is, worth of trade between China and the UK. Do you think this can just continue to kind of run concurrently, these two strands, or do they clash at some point?
I mean, they could clash at some point. I was struck yesterday listening to Oliver Dowden's statement that he was trying to walk a very difficult line between the gravity of what the UK government had found, this hostile, malicious activity, but also reassuring everyone that actually the hack didn't compromise their data in any significant way, wouldn't affect the electoral process, that the attack on parliamentarians had been intercepted, hadn't been effective, and then also the very minor action the government was proposing to take, sanctioning two individuals. So there seemed to be a disconnect between the seriousness of the issue and the action the government was taking. And I suppose, therefore, if pressure grows for more than that, then we will get to this issue of designating China a hostile state. I have to say I don't know what operational consequences that would have at all. I'm using one word rather than another.
But that struck us as well yesterday, because it's the government are very much pushing it. Oliver Dowden has spoken about it in the House of Commons. On the face of it, this is information that, it's strange that they want this information, but this is information that is available to some people. And so you're right, there is a gap between what's happened in this particular instance and when it happened a while ago, and the kind of different ramping up, the different language that's being used. We're going to declare it a threat to national security. Why do you think there is this gap?
Well, I think the government is in a very difficult place because it wants to signal the seriousness of what they've discovered. On the other hand, they don't want to frighten people that this means millions of people have had their data compromised in a way that could, risk their security. And when they come to action against China, as you say, they have to take account of the fact that the relationship with China is a complex one. Yes, we have to treat them as a potential threat in security areas, but we do £100 billion worth of trade with them both ways each year. So trade sanctions would put us straight into kind of higher inflation. We'd have to pay more for goods that we sourced elsewhere. And there is a massive amount of Chinese investment in the UK, including new battery gigafactories and so on. So I'm not sure the government want to take economic measures against China, given the need for us to find new ways of growing and cutting inflation. And they can't just leave things as they are. So designating China a threat would be a gesture. I don't think it would have any particular operational consequences. One thing I think is important is that we work very closely, as we clearly are doing, with the Americans, with the Europeans who put out a statement in solidarity with us and others, and calling out what China is doing is probably the most effective response to it, actually.
Right. I should have asked you this at the beginning. Do you think that China are a threat to our national security?
Well, as I say, I think China is such a huge country, such a massive and complex relationship with us. Reducing it to a single word doesn't make a lot of sense. Yes, they are a threat in some security areas, trying to subvert our democratic process. Yes, they are an important trading partner. And yes, we have to talk to them about issues like climate change, because we can't cut climate change without China joining in that process. So they are several things at the same time, including potentially a threat in some areas.
Look, I think it's important to understand why Russia, but also in this case, clearly China, wants to target and hoover up people's information. And I think there are basically four reasons. They collect large amounts of their own people's information. There are justified reasons for doing it, but the less justified and the more unpleasant reasons is because they want to spy on their own people to make rebellion or revolt or thinking bad things about the communist regime in China increasingly impossible. And with Muslim minorities, they simply want to oppress them. Okay, so that's the first point, but that's in China. Secondly, they want access to intellectual property. They want to steal this stuff because it just saves millions and years of research to do this development themselves. For our data, they collect large amounts of data or try to steal large amounts of data because if they're building up target packs on individuals, potentially members of parliament, potentially more importantly, computer scientists working up in Cambridge on the latest AI, cutting edge research in pharmaceuticals or big data out of Oxford or Durham or Manchester universities in graphite and other things like that. So this is just useful building block information. And the fourth reason they want this information is because in the not too distant future, we're going to be using artificial intelligence and big data to manipulate information. And therefore, to just collect a great deal of information out there in the world is a very useful thing, because one day you'll be able to process it much faster than you can now. The simple rule for all this stuff, Kate, is that increasingly information and data is power.
And look, I think we can safely say that the UK is being targeted. It is a greater threat to the UK, these cyber attacks, than ever before. And so there have been various discussions about how we try and clamp down on this if we can, and what sort of actions are appropriate against countries like China. Where do you stand on this? At the moment, we understand Oliver Dowden's tussling really with the fact that at the moment China's called a challenge, but should we change that wording to threat?
Look, I think on balance we should, but what we need is consistency. There is no point. China is a major player in the world. It's got a huge economy, the second biggest. I'm not sure it's ever going to overtake the States, because I think there are inherent problems in communist dictatorships, even quite efficient ones. But it is a major power, and we have to deal with it. And we have to deal with it in a way that we didn't have to with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union set up a rival economic system where China, for better or worse, is plugged into the global economy. We need consistency. I'm actually working on something that I think some of your Times colleagues are interested in, a project with Civitas, the think tank, to come up with a coherent China policy and what a coherent China policy looks like. And myself and a guy called Rob Clark are working on that. And I hope to get that out by May, June at the latest. And this isn't just about one individual thing. It's not just about them spying. It's about the role of Confucius Institutes, where the Chinese state keeps an eye on Chinese students, but also Hong Kong students here as well. It's about TikTok having one set of algorithms in China and a different set of algorithms outside China. It's about whether we sell arms to Taiwan. It's about the supply of rare minerals. It's about our crucial supply lines for all the things that we need, be it cars, be it computer chips, all these things. And it's about understanding our exposure to China, because if China starts a war in the South China Sea and we put down sanctions, because we are now so exposed to China in so many elements of our life, we will effectively collapse ours and the global economy by putting sanctions on China should it try to invade Taiwan. And what China wants above all, Kate, is the ability to attack Taiwan and not have to pay a price. So this question is really, really broad. And above all, we need a consistent, robust approach. And a lot of this is about protecting ourselves. It's not about waving bony fingers at people, but it's understanding and minimizing the risk that we have to China.
And look, how much of this is done on a departmental basis? We had Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, on Breakfast today talking about Confucius Institutes and insisting that the UK had clamped down on that. Now, there's various bits of reporting out. Some is that there are still operating, freely, that there isn't enough restriction on them, that they're still opening, roundly opening still. Do you sort of feel like there might be a bit of misunderstanding, perhaps, in various departments about how you can piece these actions together?
I think that's right. You make a really good point. Look, I got highest regard for Gillian, and education has been a massive success story under the Conservatives. Domestic education, secondary schools with primary schools. But looking at the China issue here, it is a fair criticism of this government and indeed any previous governments when they're dealing with Russia or when they're dealing with China, that we have not been coherent enough, and it has been too difficult to deliver a cross-governmental program. And we have to work harder for government departments to act seamlessly together. That is not a criticism of any of this government, which I'm a big supporter of. It is a general statement about the way that government has worked in this country really since the 1990s onwards, but potentially before that. We need a greater sense of coherence, and we need a greater sense of having an overview of how we can robustly defend ourselves, understand China's significant role in the world, but actually make sure that we're protecting our people, our data, but also minimizing our exposure should this relationship get much worse.
And is that one of the sort of key cornerstones of your policy suggestion on what a coherent approach to China looks like?
Yes, it is. So it's and again, a lot of this is, and Charlie Parton, who's one of these leading experts, ex-Foreign Office, who's done a lot of work on this. This is not about attacking people. It's not about accepting that we have to roll over and have our stomach tickled because China's so big and powerful. It's just a lot of this is about minimizing risk, about protecting ourselves. Let me give you some examples. On TikTok, the algorithm on TikTok in China effectively tries to make Chinese kids smart by giving them puzzles, etc., etc. The TikTok algorithms outside China is about getting people addicted to TikTok. So one of the things we could say to the Chinese, if you want TikTok in this country, you either change its algorithms or you get rid of it. Because it is, I know it sounds ridiculous to say this, or some people will think it sounds daft, but TikTok is effectively a weapon to make Chinese kids smart and Western kids dumb because of the different algorithms. So we have to understand how these social media tools are being used by authoritarian states in ways in which we find difficult to get our heads around. You look at supply lines, okay, give you one other example. We could be doing DNA research, quite easy to do DNA on cotton coming into this country, a lot of it by the big corporations and the big international firms, to find out how much of it is coming from slave labor out of Xinjiang province. Because we don't want slave labor in the global economy for moral reasons and economic reasons. A huge amount of that is moral reasons. And we could be doing more on that front as well. So those are just two examples in a really wide field.
Yeah. And I'm interested in what you've had to say about TikTok. Obviously, the United States are, working through new laws.
Well, they're going to force its sale. They're going to force its sale.
Well, they want it to come under US ownership. And if it doesn't come under US ownership, then it will not exist in the US anymore. Would you like to see something similar that is very, very direct, targeted action? It's very, very specific. It is strong. But would you like to see something similar from us here in the UK?
Yes, although the question is, the Americans are saying we don't mind the algorithms, but we don't want the information going back to China because of big data and AI being able to crunch this data and understand people's, how to manipulate people in the future. Remember that I think the critical thing here, Kate, is that dictatorships, freedom is a threat to freedom anywhere is a threat to dictatorships everywhere. So the more that dictatorships can know how to mold and manipulate people, the more that dictatorships can survive. That is bad for humanity. So we don't want that information going back to China when China is a communist dictatorship, which is building up the means of censorship and control, not loosening. And but for me, it's also an issue of the algorithms. That the algorithms, the TikTok algorithms in our country is to get people addicted to using TikTok. TikTok's algorithms in China are designed to encourage Chinese kids to be smart and to do puzzles, etc., etc.